If someone had told me a month ago that my quiet, meticulously cataloged life, would be upended by a man who smelled of smoke and authority, I would have reshelved that thought under fiction. My world was one of paper and silence. It was a fortress built of dewy decimal codes and the hushed footsteps of patrons seeking escape in other people's stories. I was the keeper of those stories, the guardian of that silence. I was not a character in one. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 10 years, the county library has been my sanctuary. A grand old building of stone and dark wood, where dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams like tiny, forgotten fairies. My routine was my prayer. Open at 9, sort the returns, water the ferns, mend the spines of wounded books. Close at 5. My heart beat in time with the slow, deliberate tick of the grandfather clock in the main hall. It was a peaceful existence, a solitary one. I had convinced myself they were the same thing. Then came the fire. It wasn't a great, consuming inferno, just a small, vicious thing that started in the electrical panel of the historical archives. A greedy, charring bite taken out of the oldest part of the building, the part one loved most, the part that held the town's memory in brittle paper and faded ink. The alarm had shrieked, a sound so alien in that sacred quiet it felt like a physical blow. By the time the fire department had finished, the air was thick with the ghosts of burnt paper and the chemical sting of retardant. My sanctuary was violated, wounded, and then he arrived. He was not a firefighter. He was something else. He came the next morning, his truck a stark, official-looking vehicle parked at an angle that seemed to command the entire street. He moved with a kind of coiled energy, a stark contrast to the shuffling, weary firefighters who had packed up hours before. He was tall, broad in a way that seemed to stretch the fabric of his simple jacket. His hair was dark, cut short. His jaw was a hard line. He was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke a word. I watched him from the library's main doorway, my arms wrapped around my chest as if holding myself together. He surveyed the building, his gaze sharp, analytical. He wasn't looking at the architecture, at the proud stone lions flanking the steps. He was looking for weaknesses, for entry points, for the story of the fire. His name, I would learn, was Cole Matthews. Fire Investigator, a title that sounded like a judgment. He saw me standing there, and his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, met mine. There was no warmth in them, just assessment. He walked towards me, his boots making a heavy, purposeful sound on the pavement, a sound that felt like an intrusion. I was the custodian here, the quiet authority. But in the face of this man, I felt like a nervous witness. I felt transparent. You the librarian? His voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the damp morning air. It wasn't unkind, but it was stripped of all pleasantries. It was a tool. I could only nod. My own voice, a thing I used for hushed inquiries and whispered readings, seemed to have deserted me. Cole Matthews. State Fire Marshal's office. He didn't offer a hand. He just held my gaze for a second too long, as if trying to read the index of my thoughts. I need to see the point of origin. I need access to the entire building. And I need to talk to you. That was how it began. Not with a hello or a sorry for your loss, but with a series of commands. He was a force of nature, a storm front moving into my calm, predictable weather system. And I, the humble meteorologist of my own small world, could only stand back and watch the barometer fall. The distance between us wasn't just the yellow tape cordoning off the damaged wing. It was a chasm of personality, of purpose. He was here to dissect the disaster. I was just trying to grieve for my books. I assumed he was straight, of course. Men like that always were. Men with that kind of easy, physical confidence and no-nonsense demeanor. It was another brick in the wall between us, a wall I was already certain was insurmountable. He was a temporary problem, a disruption. He would find his answers, write his report, and leave. And I would be left to sweep up the ash. The days that followed blurred into a routine of their own, a grim parody of my old life. The library was closed to the public, a tomb silent but for our movements. Cole's presence was a constant, a heavy weight in the air. He was methodical, relentless. He sifted through debris with a focus so intense it was unnerving. He photographed every charred wire, every blackened joist. He was a scholar of destruction. I was his reluctant guide, his key. "Where did this conduit lead?" he would ask, his voice muffled by a dust mask. "The old reading room." I'd answer, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Show me the building plans from the 1970s renovation. They're in the sub-basement archive." This way, we moved through the wounded spaces together, a strange, silent pair. He was the interrogator. I was the keeper of the building's secrets. He was all grim purpose and kinetic energy. I was all frayed nerves and a quiet, aching sadness for the loss. The air between us was thick with the smell of smoke, but also with a tension I couldn't name. It was the friction of two completely different worlds colliding. I felt his eyes on me sometimes when I was looking away, a focused, unreadable gaze. I told myself he was just being thorough. I was the one who locked up, the last one here. In his world, that made me a variable, a person of interest. The disruption was total. My quiet corners were now filled with his equipment cases. My silent halls echoed with his clipped phone calls to labs and supervisors. He drank his coffee black and bitter from a steel thermos, leaving rings on surfaces I used to polish daily. He was an invasion, a necessary, infuriating, and utterly captivating invasion. To protect myself, I began to study him as if he were a difficult text, a book written in a language I didn't understand. I watched the way his hands, surprisingly deft for their size, handled delicate pieces of charred evidence. I watched the muscles in his back tense under his shirt as he pried at a warped floorboard. I watched the way a furrow of intense concentration would appear between his brows, a subtle shift in the hard mask of his face. This was the new status quo, a world of soot and suspicion, inhabited by a quiet librarian and the investigator who seemed to be made of granite and smoke. The distance between us felt as vast and as scorched as the ruined wing of my library. I couldn't wait for him to be gone. I was terrified of the silence he would leave behind. The library became our shared world, a damaged island floating in the sea of the normal, everyday town. The forced proximity was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in my chest. For hours on end, we would be the only two souls in the vast, echoing building. The silence, once my comfort, was now a canvas for the sounds he made. The scrape of his boot, the soft zip of an evidence bag, the low murmur of his voice on the phone. Each sound was an intrusion, a reminder that my solitude was no longer my own. He needed me. That was the crux of it. I was the living index of the building. I knew its history, its quirks, its secret pains. I knew the story of the 1972 flood that had warped the floorboards in the basement and the shoddy electrical work from the 1988 budget renovation that everyone had forgotten. My knowledge, once a source of quiet, personal pride, was now a critical tool for his investigation. "The town council minutes from 1988, he said one afternoon, not looking up from a blackened fuse box. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "They're in the municipal vault," I replied, "but I have the microfilm copies here, in the West Archive." It's mostly untouched by the smoke. He finally looked at me. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. "Lead the way." We descended into the cool, dry air of the West Archive, a labyrinth of rolling shelves and cardboard boxes filled with the town's paper trail. The air here smelled of old paper and binder's glue, a scent that was like a balm to my soul. It was my territory. For the first time since he'd arrived, I felt a flicker of my old self. I found the correct microfilm reel with an efficiency born of long practice. As I threaded it onto the reader, I was aware of him standing just behind me. Too close. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of soap beneath the lingering smoke on his clothes. My own body went rigid. Every nerve ending felt suddenly awake, raw. I was intensely aware of the back of my neck, of the small hairs there. I felt as if a current was passing between us in the still, dusty air. This was the new reality. Long periods of professional distance, punctuated by these sudden, shocking moments of physical closeness. Our hands would brush as we looked at a schematic. Our shoulders would knock as we navigated a narrow, debris-strewn hallway. Each accidental contact was like a small electric shock, a jolt that left an invisible scorch mark on my skin. And each time, he would pull back as if he'd felt it too, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight. The investigation dragged on. A week turned into two. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a strange, tense domesticity. I learned that he took exactly 2 sugars in his coffee, a fact I gleaned from watching him at the break room counter. I learned that he had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was frustrated, a gesture of profound weariness that momentarily cracked his stoic facade. It was in these small moments that the thaw began. Not with words, but with observation. I was, by nature, an observer. I watched people from the safety of my circulation desk, guessing at their lives from their book choices. I applied this same skill to Cole, collecting data points, trying to assemble a picture of the man behind the badge. I started to notice things. A faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, pale against his tan skin. I wonder how he got it. A fight? An accident? A fire? The skin around his eyes was etched with fine lines, the map of long hours spent squinting at details, at sunlight, at tragedy. His hands were not just large, they were a landscape of work. Calluses on his palms, a network of faint, silvery scars across his knuckles. These were not the hands of a man who sat behind a desk. These were hands that knew how to break things down, how to find the truth inside the wreckage. One evening, we were working late. The cleanup crew had left, and the library was plunged back into its familiar, heavy silence. I was at a long table in the main hall, painstakingly trying to salvage water-damaged town records, blotting each page with a tenderness that felt like a form of prayer. Cole was a few feet away, hunched over a collection of charred wires, meticulously tagging and bagging each one. He suddenly swore, a low, guttural sound of pure frustration. He straightened up and dragged a hand through his hair. In the harsh glare of the work lamps, I saw the exhaustion etched onto his face. It was more than just physical tiredness. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness. The confident, intimidating investigator was gone. In his place was a man who looked profoundly, achingly alone. My heart did a strange, painful lurch in my chest. It was a feeling I hadn't anticipated. Empathy, a dangerous, unwelcome bridge across the chasm between us. Without thinking, I stood up and walked to the small kitchenette. I brewed a pot of tea, the herbal kind I drank when my nerves were shot. I poured it into 2 mugs and brought one over to him, setting it down on a clear space on his work table. He stared at the mug as if he'd never seen one before. Then his gaze lifted to my face. The surprise in his eyes was so naked, so unguarded. It was like seeing him for the first time. The hard mask of the investigator had slipped, and for a fleeting second, I saw something vulnerable underneath. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice rough. He wrapped his large hands around the warm ceramic, a gesture that seemed almost reverent. I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight, and retreated to my own table. But the space between us had changed. A single, small act of kindness had altered the emotional geography of the room. I had offered comfort, and he had accepted it. It was a tiny shift, but it felt seismic. The next day brought the first real touch. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't a clumsy brush of hands. It was intentional. We were in the attic, a space I'd always hated, filled with forgotten furniture and the ghosts of dead pigeons. The air was thick with dust and the heat of the summer sun on the slate roof. Cole was on a rickety wooden ladder, examining the rafters for smoke damage. I was below, holding a high-powered flashlight, my neck craned at an uncomfortable angle. The ladder wobbled, a small, sickening creak of old wood under strain. I saw his body tense, his knuckles white where he gripped the rung. Instinct took over. I dropped the flashlight and lunged forward, my hands finding the wooden legs of the ladder, steadying it. "I've got it," I said, my voice coming out breathier than I intended. He looked down at me. The space was tight, and his face was only a few feet from mine. Dust motes swirled in the beam of my fallen flashlight, illuminating the scene in a hazy, dreamlike glow. I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. He came down the ladder slowly, deliberately. When he reached the bottom, he stepped off, but he didn't move away. He was standing so close, I had to tilt my head back to look at him. "Thanks," he said again. His voice was low, and then he reached out. His hand, warm and calloused, cupped my shoulder. It wasn't a pat. It wasn't a casual gesture. His fingers pressed lightly into the muscle, a firm, grounding weight. My heart hammered against my ribs like a frantic, trapped bird. The heat from his palm seemed to sink right through my shirt, through my skin, deep into my bones. My entire universe contracted to that single point of contact. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the shocking, terrifying, wonderful weight of his hand on me. It only lasted a few seconds. He dropped his hand, and the air rushed back into my lungs. He cleared his throat, a rough sound in the dusty silence, and turned back to his equipment, his movements suddenly stiff. The professional mask was back in place, but it was too late. Something had been broken, or maybe something had been built. A connection, as fragile and as real as a spider's thread, was now strung between us in the dusty, forgotten attic. The power dynamic had shifted again. I'd been his guide, his key. But in that moment, when I had steadied him, I had become his anchor, and I had the terrifying suspicion that I was the one who was truly unmoored. The moment in the attic became a silent, unspoken thing between us. A live wire we were both careful not to touch again, but its current still hummed in the air. The dynamic had undeniably shifted. I was no longer just the librarian, the witness. I was the one who knew the building's bones, and in one brief, terrifying moment, I had been the one to keep him from falling. He started to ask my opinion. "What do you think, Elias?" he asked one afternoon, gesturing to a series of old photographs of the library's construction. "These support beams, they look different from the blueprints." He used my name. "Not librarian, Elias." It sounded strange in his deep voice. Solid. Real. I stepped closer, leaning over the table to look at the photos. "They are," I said, my own voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "There was a partial collapse during the Great Snow of '47. They reinforced this section with steel, but it was never officially recorded in the main plans. The records are in the founder's correspondence." He looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. "Show me." That night, we found ourselves in the deepest, most remote part of the archives, a climate-controlled room where the town's oldest documents were kept. It was a place of profound silence, where the air itself seemed heavy with history. The room was small, crammed with metal shelves and flat file drawers. We had to move carefully to avoid bumping into each other. It was a forced intimacy, a shared space that felt miles away from the rest of the world. A storm had been threatening all day, and it finally broke. Rain lashed against the small, high windows. The wind howled around the corners of the old building. It felt like we were in a ship battened down against a gale. Then, with a flicker and a groan, the lights went out. We were plunged into absolute darkness. A blackness so complete it felt like a physical substance. "Stay put." Cole's voice came out of the dark, startlingly close. I heard a rustle, then the sharp click and bright beam of a flashlight cut through the black. He played the light around the small room, its beam catching on the spines of ancient books, on the steel of the shelves, on the dust in the air. Then the beam found my face. I flinched, raising a hand to shield my eyes. "Sorry," he said, lowering the beam to the floor. The light cast our shadows, huge and distorted, against the shelves. They danced and swayed, two giants trapped in a tiny room. "The generator should have kicked in," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Breaker must have tripped," he replied. "We're stuck here until it passes. No point navigating the debris in the dark." Stuck. The word echoed in the small space. The sound of the rain was a dull roar outside. Inside, the silence was broken only by the sound of our breathing. It felt dangerous. The carefully constructed walls of professionalism had been washed away by the storm and the darkness. We were just two people, a man who chased fires and a man who curated silence. We sat on the floor, our backs against a cool metal shelf. He had placed a flashlight on a box, pointing it at the ceiling, so the room was filled with a soft, indirect glow. It was an intimate, confidential light. A campfire light. A light for telling secrets. "You hate this, don't you?" he said after a long silence. His voice was different, softer, devoid of its usual authoritative edge. "What?" I asked, confused. "This. The noise. The mess. The disruption. This whole investigation." He shifted, and his knee brushed against mine. A spark. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. "This place is not just a building to you, is it?" I swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room. "It's my life," I whispered. The confession felt huge, a monumental admission of my small, cloistered existence. "It's quiet. It's ordered." Or it was. He was silent for a moment. I could feel him studying my profile in the dim light. "I get it," he said, and the simple words were a revelation. "My life is the opposite. Never in one place for more than a few months. Always moving. Always chasing the next call. Hotels. Dines. Never putting down roots." He paused. "Sometimes I think I wouldn't know what to do with quiet if I found it." It was the most he had ever said about himself. A door had opened a crack, showing me a glimpse of the lonely landscape inside him. The strong, silent man was lonely. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. "Why did you become a librarian?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. I thought for a moment, the rain a steady drum against the roof. "Because stories are safer than people," I said, the truth of it surprising even me. "They have beginnings and middles and ends. They make sense. People are messy. They don't follow a narrative." He turned his head to look at me fully. In the dim, reflected light, his face was all shadows and angles. His gray eyes seemed almost black. "And what about your story, Elias?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What's the narrative?" My heart was beating a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. The air was electric. This was it. A turning point. A chapter break. I could retreat into the safety of my shell, or I could be brave. It was supposed to be a quiet one. I breathed, my gaze locked on his. A story about a man and his books. But lately there's been a plot twist. A small, sad smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Mine too." He leaned in. It was slow, excruciatingly, beautifully slow, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop it, to retreat back into my safe, quiet story. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a terrifying, exhilarating hope. His lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was a question. It was hesitant, gentle, searching. His lips were soft, warm, tasting faintly of coffee and the rain-washed air. His hand came up, not to my shoulder this time, but to my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The callous skin was an abrasive, wonderful shock against mine. I leaned into the kiss, my eyes fluttering shut. All the tension, all the anxiety, all the unspoken longing of the past weeks melted away, replaced by a feeling so profound, so overwhelming, it left me breathless. It was a feeling of being seen, of being understood. In the heart of my silent, ordered world, surrounded by darkness and the storm, this man, this stranger who had invaded my life, was kissing me as if he were reading the last page of a book he never wanted to end. It was the most honest, terrifying, and beautiful thing that had ever happened to me. The world came back into focus with the harsh, unforgiving light of morning. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the high windows of the archive, illuminating the dust in the air and the mess we had made of my carefully ordered emotions. I woke up on the floor, a soft blanket I didn't remember getting draped over me. I was alone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized me. I sat up, my heart pounding a sick, frantic rhythm. Cole was gone. His flashlight was on the box where he'd left it. Next to it was his thermos, and a hastily scrawled note on a scrap of paper torn from his notebook. Power's back on. Had to file the preliminary. Talk later. Talk later. The words were a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of anxiety crashing over me. My mind, my worst enemy, began its vicious assault. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness in the dark. a strange intimacy born of a storm and forced proximity. It meant nothing to him. He was a professional, and last night was a severe, regrettable lapse in judgment. He was probably already regretting it, disgusted with himself, with me. I stumbled through the library, the familiar spaces now feeling alien and hostile. The sunlight felt accusatory. Every charred beam, every pile of debris seemed to mock me. I let my guard down. I had allowed this man, this force of nature, to breach the walls of my fortress, and now he was gone, leaving me in the ruins. The kiss, which had felt so real, so profound in the darkness, now seemed like a fever dream, a fantasy I had constructed out of loneliness and stress. I spent the day in a state of suspended panic. Every time I heard a vehicle outside, my head would snap up, a wild, stupid hope flaring in my chest, only to be extinguished when it drove past. I tried to work to bring order to the chaos, but my hands shook. I couldn't focus. The silence of the library, once a comfort, was now a roaring void, amplifying the sound of my own self-recrimination. He wasn't coming back. Of course he wasn't. Men like Cole didn't get involved with quiet, anxious librarians. They moved on. They always moved on. The hours crawled by. Afternoon bled into evening. The library grew dark again, but this time, the darkness offered no comfort. It was just empty. I stood in the main hall, surrounded by the ghosts of my books and the fresh, new ghost of him, and felt a desolation so complete it was a physical ache in my chest. My solitude, my old, familiar friend, had returned. But it was different now. It was tainted. It was no longer a peaceful state of being. It was the sharp, painful awareness of an absence. It was the shape of Cole carved out of the air. I finally locked up, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked home under the streetlights, feeling exposed and raw. My small apartment, usually a haven, felt like a cage. I couldn't settle. I paced the floor, replaying every moment of the night before, analyzing every word, every touch, searching for clues I might have missed. But all I found was my own foolish, desperate hope. The next day was the same. A long, agonizing stretch of silence. I went to the library. I worked. I waited. Nothing. I saw his official truck was gone from its spot in front of the building. My heart plummeted into my stomach. He was gone. He had finished his work and left town without a word. Talk later. A lie. A kind, professional lie to soften the blow of his escape. The self-loathing was a bitter taste in my mouth. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have mistaken a moment of shared vulnerability for something more? He was a mystery I had tried to solve, and I had gotten the answer devastatingly wrong. I was just a footnote in his report, a local contact, a means to an end. That night, I decided to erase him. I would clean the library, I would restore the order, and I would rebuild my walls stronger and higher than before. This was a lesson, a painful, searing lesson in the folly of wanting something more than what I had. People were messy. I had been right all along, and I had just been caught in the middle of Cole Matthews' mess. I was sitting in my armchair, a book open in my lap, its words a meaningless jumble, when I heard the knock. It was late after 10. I never had visitors. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, terrified thing. I told myself it was Mrs. Henderson from next door, wanting to borrow some sugar. I told myself it was a lost delivery person. I told myself it was anything but the one thing I desperately, foolishly hoped it was. I opened the door, and there he was, Cole, standing on my doorstep, illuminated by the yellow glow of the porch light. He wasn't in his uniform jacket. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked wrecked. The exhaustion I'd seen in him at the library was back tenfold. His shoulders were slumped. His hair was a mess, as if he'd been driving his hands through it. He wasn't the confident, imposing investigator. He was just a man who looked as lost and terrified as I felt. We just stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything that had gone unsaid for the past 2 days. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I stepped back, holding the door open, my body moving on autopilot. He walked into my small living room. and it felt as if the space had shrunk by half. He was too big for my world, too real. He didn't sit. He just stood in the middle of the room, looking at my shelves of books, at the neat stacks of paper on my desk, at the quiet, ordered life I had built. "I'm sorry," he said, finally turning to face me. "I am so sorry, Elias." The words and the raw sincerity in his voice cracked the icy shell of my anger and fear. "I had to close the case," he went on, his words coming in a rush. "I had to file the final report, do the debrief. I had to finish the job. That's what I do. I finish the job, and I move on." He looked at me, his gray eyes pleading. But I couldn't. I drove 2 hours out of town, and all I could think about was the silence in that room. "And you," he took a step closer. "I ran," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What happened between us, it's not in my manual, Elias. It's not part of the procedure. It scared the hell out of me. I'm not good at this. I'm good at finding answers in ashes. I'm not good at this." He gestured vaguely at the space between us. The fear, the raw vulnerability on his face mirrored my own. The strong, silent man was just as afraid as I was. We were two sides of the same coin. He ran from connection, and I hid from it. "I thought you regretted it," I heard myself say, the voice small, fragile. "I thought it was a mistake." He closed the distance between us in a single stride. He cupped my face in his hands, his palms warm and rough against my skin. His gaze was so intense it felt like he was looking directly into my soul. "A mistake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Elias, it was the only thing that's made sense to me in years." And then he kissed me again. And this time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of apology, of relief, of a desperate, terrifying hope. It was a kiss that said all the things we didn't know how to say. It was a promise. When we finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. I could feel the slight tremble in his hands. "I don't know what we're doing," he murmured against my skin. "This is new territory for me. I'm probably going to mess it up." "Me too," I whispered back, a real, watery smile finally breaking through. "My life has a very strict organizational system. You are a major disruption." He pulled back slightly, a ghost of a smile on his own lips. "Is that a bad thing?" I looked at him, at this man who had turned my world upside down, who had filled my silence with noise and my order with chaos. I looked at the fear and the hope warring in his beautiful, tired eyes. "No," I said, the single word feeling like the truest thing I had ever spoken. "It's not a bad thing at all." He didn't leave that night. And in a gesture that spoke more than 1,000 words, he went out to his truck and brought in a single cardboard box. It wasn't large. It looked worn, the corners softened from travel. He sat down on my living room floor. "My transfer case," he said, his voice quiet. "It has everything I need to start over somewhere." He opened it. Inside, there were a few changes of clothes, a worn paperback novel, a framed picture of a dog I didn't recognize, and a heavy, chipped ceramic coffee mug. He picked up the mug, held it for a moment, then walked into my small kitchen. I followed him, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm for the first time in days. He opened a cabinet, pushed aside my own identical white mugs, and placed us squarely in the middle of the shelf. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "Is this okay?" he asked. It was more than a question about a coffee mug. He was asking if he could stay, if he could unpack, if he could disrupt my neat, orderly shelves forever. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing through his. His hand, which I had once seen as a tool of his trade, felt like an anchor. It felt like home. "It's perfect," I said. The new beginning didn't arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic swell of music. It arrived with the quiet hum of a coffee maker the next morning. It arrived with the soft, unfamiliar weight of another person in my bed, a warmth that seeped into my bones and chased away a chill I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I woke first, as I always did, but instead of the familiar emptiness of my apartment, there was him, Cole, asleep on his side, his face half buried in the pillow. In sleep, the hard lines of his face were softened, the constant tension in his jaw gone. He looked younger, vulnerable. One of his arms was thrown over my waist, a heavy, possessive weight that felt more reassuring than any words. I lay there for a long time, just watching him breathe. The morning light, which for the past few days had felt so harsh and accusatory, was now gentle. It filtered through the blinds, painting soft stripes across his bare back. I could see the landscape of his skin, the faint scars and moles, the powerful curve of his shoulders. This man, who had been a complete stranger, an antagonist in my story, was now the most intimate part of my world. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen. I moved with a practiced silence, but every small sound, the click of the cabinet, the gurgle of the coffee maker, felt different. It wasn't my silence anymore. It was our quiet. I was pouring the coffee when I felt his presence behind me. I turned, and he was leaning against the doorframe, watching me. He was wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants, which were comically short on him. A real, genuine smile touched his lips. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own smile feeling easy and natural. "Coffee." He walked over and took the mug I offered him. It was his mug, the chipped one. Seeing in my kitchen, in his hand, felt profoundly significant. A small, domestic act that was a declaration of intent. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the mug. "I could get used to this," he said quietly. My heart swelled with a feeling so warm and expansive I thought it might burst. Me too. The days that followed were a gentle unfolding. We learned each other's rhythms. We created a new routine, a shared one. He was an early riser like me. We would drink coffee in the soft morning light, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in a comfortable silence that was a universe away from the tense, anxious silence we had shared in the library. He helped me with the cleanup, his methodical nature now a source of comfort rather than intimidation. We worked side by side, sorting books, cleaning shelves, slowly but surely bringing my sanctuary back to life. But it wasn't just my sanctuary anymore. He told me about his life, about growing up in a series of foster homes, about finding a purpose, a sense of order in the rigid structure of his job. He told me about the fires, the sad, empty spaces he had to walk through, the ghost he carried. I told him about my quiet life, about the fear that had kept me locked behind my walls of books, about the loneliness I had pretended was peace. We were mapping each other's hidden landscapes, finding that our territories, though they looked so different on the surface, were bordered by the same fears and the same deep, unspoken longing for a place to call home. I look back now at the man I was before the fire, the man who lived in a world of paper and ink, who believed that solitude was safety. My life was a perfectly preserved document in a climate-controlled room, untouched, unchanging, and ultimately unread. I had built my fortress so well that I had become its prisoner. Cole was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the fire. He was the chaos that breached my walls and turned my ordered world to ash. He came into my life smelling of smoke and destruction, an investigator sent to find the cause of the damage. But what he ended up investigating was me. He sifted through the wreckage of my carefully constructed solitude and found the point of origin for my fear. And in doing so, he didn't just solve a case. He saved me. He led me out of the smoke and into the clean, clear air. My life is no longer silent. It's filled with the sound of his low laughter, with the classic rock music he plays while he cooks, with the quiet murmur of our conversations late at night. My world is no longer just mine. It's ours. And the quiet I have now is not the quiet of absence, but the profound, peaceful quiet of presence. It's the quiet of two people sitting together, reading in the evening light. It's the quiet of a shared glance across a room. It's the quiet of a hand finding yours in the dark. It is the best, most beautiful quiet I have ever known. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the direction of your life? A plot twist you never saw coming? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing for more stories about finding love in the most unexpected of places.